But anyway, back to Jeremy Bentham. So we were talking about, Enlightenment. You did have a lot of those types of people, and you had the logical excess of which Marquis de Sade was sort of fully lived out and sought out that whole entire. The deal with Sade, I've watched like some documentary on him. Yeah, I think that there was somebody, it might have been Simone de Beauvoir, might have been saying he might have been autistic, and he definitely had antisocial personality disorder. Because you're talking like when she wrote, I think, Should We Burn Sod, I think is the book she wrote. That was about the time, like, psychology, and like it was like maybe well into the 1900s, so you're looking at modernity. So like, yeah, we could. It just with the Sod, it just seemed like, to give the gist of it, like he wrote this book called 140 Days of Sodom, I think, and to put it without like, because it gets like really really intensely, just like think of like the worst possible, the most licentious, the most violent, like, well, his name is how sadomasochistic came about, but just think of the most aberrant behavior ever. That's basically Sod. Yeah, his book basically indulged in all like those fantasies. Like, to put it in a way where I don't describe the finer details, is like this man about middle age, I think, recruits like a group of like a hundred girls, and he basically like keeps them prison there, and they basically just have orgies the whole entire time. And like he goes through like this list of like all these, and he gets progressively more outlandish with each one, like trying all manner and all like pretty much every imaginable vice, I think. So that's why it's called 120 Days of Sodom, because they're stuck with him for like on this estate, cut off from society for like so long. So yeah, there's like Sod, I guess it's like he was just taking that Enlightenment idea of like modernity and like progress and promiscuity is now it's not taboo anymore. It's like he's taking that to its logical conclusion, I think. And yeah, I think he was married, and like I think he actually was married to the same woman, but he and his wife like would basically recruit like these young girls that would be like sex slaves pretty much, but it was like slightly consensual. And
slightly
like
consensual.
he'd like recruit. It sounded eerily similar to like how cults work nowadays. Like you hear like like just with the Allison Mack thing with like her, she was basically like almost this dignitary, or like like to like, oh, I'm gonna be this person, I'm gonna recruit this person and this person, and then pretty much just like continue to go out and like pick up young girls and like impressionable younger girls and get them and basically manipulate them into being a part of that. And like the good way of doing that is with this like young reputable young actress. So it's like there was something maybe a little bit similar going on with Sod. Like he had like maybe younger people recruit more, pretty much trafficking is what it sounded like. Yeah, and I think during the time France was a little bit looser from what I've heard on like, so he was like imprisoned for some time, but then they let him out, and they pretty much let him on his island, like his own island. They're like, okay, we're gonna get rid of you, we're gonna put you on an island. And then I think even on his island, like he still had like all the sex slaves and everything. So I was like, what's the point?
They couldn't stop the Trogenbach.
Yeah, they couldn't stop Sod. And yeah, I think Albert Camus said of him like, well, you can expect his work, something along the lines of like, you can expect his work to be one of like deviant, violent, libertine behavior, because he was incarcerated for like most of his life. And I think even Napoleon like incarcerated him too. Like he was like I don't like him. Get him put him in jail.
Get rid of him.
Lock him up. So yeah, I think like Camus said something like, well, you can only expect that to come from somebody who's been like incarcerated for all his life. So like that type of philosophy that you get from him, like just expect it to be twisted and abnormal. So yeah, and Enlightenment seemed to last for a while. I think till the mid 1800s. Not to say you didn't have a lot of like great icons of the Enlightenment, Goethe, Schiller, philosophers like Hegel. There seemed to be like, again, sort of a rebirth of Greek ideas in there again. And it overlapped a lot with Romanticism, and maybe a little bit with the Transcendentalist movement as well, which also is big in America too, with like Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, Emerson, which was a little bit like Rousseauian too. So let's talk Rousseau versus Thomas Hobbes. Jean-Jacques Rousseau versus Thomas Hobbes. And with Thomas Hobbes being more, they both expounded on the social contract theory, which deals with how governments negotiate with their subjects, I guess you could say, or their citizens. And Hobbes had a more sort of crueler, sort of abject view of it, where the state has, or like the individual has a right to the state. Like he was born into this, even though like he may have sort of inherited a bit of an onus upon himself from the state, he has, like the state cares for him and does this, and in turn the individual must like work, or just in a sense that there's like certain amenities provided by the government, like the postal service, for example, which operates off of like sort of just taxes, really. It's sort of like a free service to everybody based on the assumption that you pay taxes. So it's this thing where it's like, because you get these little amenities, you're gonna have to pay taxes. Like there's like a reciprocity that goes on. And Rousseau is basically the antithesis to that, in the sense that he thought that Thomas Hobbes, well actually I think Thomas Hobbes might not have been around the same time. I think Rousseau might have been a little bit after Thomas Hobbes, well into the 1700s. But yeah, he said that in that this state is basically robbing you of your autonomy, and man is born. He basically said, like, one of his famous quotes is, "Man is born free, yet everywhere he's in chains," because they're born into this, this state that sort of exacts control over them. And his view is that he actually, I think, he didn't come up with the view, but like he sort of adhered to the noble savage view of like, if even like the most sort of brutish type of seemingly savage people, like you even see in Pocahontas, for example, like Indians being like good-hearted and sort of like a diamond in the rough, or like they're holy fools, like they may be lacking in civility in the way we think, but like they're actually capable of being good-natured, warm-hearted people. And I think that's tenuous a little bit sometimes. You do see instances where that happens, but then on other occasions you have like honor killings by like African tribes, like where it's a very natural thing for them to do. They've constructed these myths, or like they've constructed these rules on how to live by, and a lot of it has to do with like the tribe and like the family. And like if you dishonor your family, like for example, if like they find out like one of their daughters isn't a virgin, like they can like torture them, and I think like end up having the power to kill them. We leave off. We're talking about like the noble savage and Rousseau versus Thomas Hobbes in the social contract. And I guess to give a little bit more insight about Thomas Hobbes, he wrote a work which is one of his, I guess, masterworks. It was a book called Leviathan, and it outlined his version of the social contract theory. And I think Hobbes famously said something along the effects that like life is brutish, short, meaningless, or something like that. It's like it's sort of like it's like meant to be sort of controlled, I think, or like it's best when it's like under the influence of the state. I've noticed another thing that shows up a lot in Rousseau type of strands of thought, because it's such like these fundamental principles of like, okay, so are you more of a innatist or are you a determinist? There's so many different things that factor into like how you view sort of like humanity as a whole, really, and like how it forms into societies. And Steven Pinker wrote this really great book called The Blank Slate in 2002, I believe, and it went like basically from the beginning, starting all the way back, like tabula rasa is what he was looking at, the blank slate. And he outlined a lot of sort of the initial philosophies arising. I think like tabula rasa sort of literally means, I think it's Latin to like to scribe, I think. So it's like you literally like imagine somebody inscribing words on a slate and on a tablet maybe. And basically somebody who believes in a blank slate believes that personal freedom and behavior shapes how a person will be in the future, and it's their own autonomy and decision making and individuality that can shape their future. Whereas an innatist, I think, or a determinist, I think I might be conflating those terms, will think that there's actually an inborn, inherent set of traits that arises with everybody, and that there's some things that are just genetic. Like one of those is obvious, like talent would be a big one. Like fundamentally you could look at talent like, well, I just got here by pure choice, and I've cultivated habits and I've disciplined myself, and from that pure rugged individualism, like almost an Ayn Rand type of objectivism, where like you've arise there from their own thing, and everybody has the right to do that. And that's where classical liberalism arises from with John Locke, because he thought people were blank slates, and he thought that it gave people freedom to sort of, promote rights and freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and it was a very positive, bright idea. And there's not much I really have like contention with that personally, but it can maybe be leaving out some fundamental part of us, where I'm maybe leaning, because Steven Pinker, I think, sort of ultimately sided with the innatist side, I believe, like where we inherent traits and there's certain aspects of fundamental in our nature that we can't change. And I think I side a little bit more with that, but I do like the prospect. It's like of sort of the initial sort of idea of everybody having this freedom and egalitarianism, and it sounds good on paper, but it's just so hard to map out, because you find people differing, even if it's not a genetic difference. It could be a societal difference, or varying predispositions people have about things, and it's very hard to like just say, well, it's just offer equal opportunity for everybody and allow everybody, and cut ties between the state, and the government has no say in what the people that they're there to serve the people. It's democracy, people rule, popular sovereignty says says all, and it's just very hard to say that, and he did influence a lot. Like Jean Locke had a lot of I think there's a lot of similar ideas and inspiration, I think, that John Rawls got from it in his work, A Theory of Justice, of liberalism and free speech and rights, and sort of not like an equality of outcomes, but like definitely like sort of promoting equality on like all spheres and like for everybody. And yeah, he did map it out really, from what I've heard with John Rawls. He did like map it out really in a humane way that seems like that it's rooted in like philosophy, and it's rooted in human rights and ethics, and he does have a really good worldview. But like, yeah, there is a little bit of maybe too much staking, too much faith in people's like fundamental ability to choose to be what they to be basically to like choose on their own volition. Whereas,
yeah, this is something I've
biologically inclined, like
trying to figure out for a while now, of how much of just how much of someone's personality is determined by genetics, and how much can you actually change in what way. And I think this also ties into just the idea of free will in general, and like I think it ties also into just why it's so difficult to change your habits, to willingly change your habits. Why is it so difficult? Why does it seem like some people can just do it and others can't? Or why is it so hard? It's just. And there's also
interesting cases of like twins, for example, which I think Marlon Brando actually mentioned in an interview with Connie Chung. I think with he gave. I think she was asking about talent, like where does talent come from? Like, surely you worked hard for it. I think she was like maybe implying that he worked hard for it, and then he was saying, well, there's this instance of a set of twins, and one of them was raised in the other side of the country, I think, maybe not the far end, but like considerably far apart, and both of them developed the same habits. Like they both like drove the same car, I think, like the same model car, and both of them had like even like down to like the minutia of their individual habits. I think like both of them like sort of like had the same mannerisms, I think, and same like gesticulations. And it's just like it's interesting, because it's like are we the conscious arbiter of our thoughts? Are we ticking on like clockwork? Is it everything causal determined? Is everything set into motion by is it a Sam Harris type of thing, where all of us have the illusion of free will, and we sort of cling to this idea of what the self is, and that like I'm the author of my thoughts, I can choose the next word I'm going to say. But like really, even if you do think about that, like even if I say like like train track, like it will.
Yeah, why did you choose
why did
the word
I choose
train
that?
track?
It could be in spite, because it's like, well, it's absurd, but like it's just arbitrary, and just in a sense of just reacting against maybe a perceived like I don't know, normative concept of what you should be thinking, maybe. Because even if you do that out of like spite, or out of to subvert somebody's expectations, like it's still like neurons, which I'm still on the fence about that too. Like how much of anything that we do is just biologically, neurologically compelled. Like is everything just like compelled by neurons, or are we just a set of neurons? Because there's very interesting topics about the self too. Like what is the self? Because we adhere to this idea of what we are, and that like maybe I'm a set of these values, or I think Locke, because Locke was an empiricist, so he believed that knowledge fundamentally was intercepted by the senses, or enacted and perceived through the senses.
What was?
John Locke was that's empiricism, which John Locke was like sort of a proprietor of. So there's this, for him, what he basically, I think he said the self was just like a container, a consistent container of like memories, ideas and concepts, and like your body too is sort of like, okay, well, the body that I occupied from, I guess from even conception, and it goes back to like, do you think that life starts at conception, and or whatever like consistent body that you've had. I think whatever vessel you occupy over life is what he called the self, I think, and like the memories it occupies. Whereas there's the great dilemma of, I think Thomas Nagel was talking about with like the teletransporter, going on a different planet, and if there was
an exact copy,
an exact atom for atom, quark for quark copy of you, being copied and transported onto that planet. And like he said that, don't worry, like all your thoughts are in me, I'm atom for atom, action, like basically fundamentally like the same as you, materially and experientially, still you would feel there'd still be an imposter effect.
I do kind of have somewhat of a counter argument to that logic though, because even if this was an atom for atom replication of you, it wouldn't really, in a certain way, it still wouldn't really actually be you, and not even in some kind of weird philosophical argument about what does it mean to have an identity, or be, what is the I, what is the self. Forget all that. The fact that this other version of you was created using some technology or replicator, and the fact that this other version of you is not in the same location as you, same physical location, it's a different location, which means it is not, even on a philosophical level, there should be no confusion that it is synonymous with you. No, this is just a copy of
me. Because it's like
now there's two people who have the memory,
same identity
that
fundamentally
was only exclusive to me. Now there's another person who has that.
So like picking up.
There is no, so in that sense there shouldn't be any sort. It would be like saying like, oh no, my identical twin, is it me? It's like, no, it's not. It is not.
Yeah, but I'd say like
not quite the same, of course.
A little bit different.
That is different, because the identical twin does not have your memories and experiences as well.
Genes.
But still, my point is, it's just like the machine and I don't want to spoil the movie, but anyway, I won't even mention the movie because I might be spoiling it by mentioning that. But
you also get into like somewhat physics too, into that territory, because I think it sounds like it's somewhat similar to like Schrodinger's cat too. Like I think it's like
Trogenbach's cat.
I think his hypothesis was that like two objects can occupy the same space at the same time or something like that. Or is that it was possible in some, I don't know if it had to do with like different realities or whatever. But like it's weird, because is this thing just like another derivation of like something like, is it maybe replicated based off of like one cell maybe, and it's going off of that, and it's it's constructing this whole entire artificial. And there's also the thing that I think fundamentally is the mark of consciousness, is the fact that like the definitional use of the term, like what is it like to be that thing. The fact is I have absolutely no clue what it's like to be that teleprompter clone of myself. Like there's no knowledge. I guess there's not that subjective qualia whatsoever. For all I know, it could be just like this, like an AI Turing test, where it's like, how do I know if I'm talking with an alien or an
but
AI?
Is that really the most reasonable conclusion?
Because it's like, I could always say like, oh, like he has my memories, my this, my that. He's atom for atom the same as me. I could choose not to be skeptical. I could choose to be like, well, how do I not know he's just not an imposter?
But the question,
at the same time.
Question
maybe
is
that's
not, the question
like deflecting
be,
it. Maybe
the question shouldn't be, well, what if it's this? Well, what if it's this? Well, what if it's this? And what if it? It's like, what if there's, what if there's a giant space dragon hiding on the dark side of the moon? What if, I mean, it's possible. It's not really an issue about that. The real question is it reasonable to believe that? Is there any reason to believe that? So if there was a copy of you made, and by every indication it was just a copy of you with every memory and experience, whatever, then the reasonable conclusion would be that this is a copy of me, atom for atom, and not, oh, this is some kind of advanced robot test. Ooh, it's like,
I think the big question is,
at that point,
what is it like to be that thing? Because we're talking materialistically.
Well, it would be reasonable to assume, I think, that what it's like to be that thing.
And then there's when the lights turn on. Consciousness. It's
reasonable to assume that what it's like to be that clone of you, it's just like how it is being you right now. That's what it's like to be.
But you lose that sense of identity, though, unless.
Well, no, you're
thinking like
that's what
somewhat Buddhist terms, where you're transcending identity, where you don't cling to any sense of identity.
He's not one-to-one identical with you. He's not, because he's in a different location. That's one difference right off the bat.
Yeah.
And now his experiences are diverging from you. From the point of duplication, they're now going like this, the experiences. So that's another point of difference. And then, so every little thing will make a difference in that, because of, one person, he will now feel different than you psychologically, because he's the copy that made it to the other place, and you're the one that got left behind, just stuff like that. But the point is, it is a duplication, but it's not. There is no identity. There shouldn't be an identity issue. I mean, it's definitely a bizarre, complicated scenario, and it would be weird, but it's not.
It does bring
you're
ethics
still
into the matter too. It's like, how ethical is this? Does it fit into the same context of ethics, or? Because I think what I'm trying to get at is like the inner subjective realm that I experience. Like, I have no idea what it's like to be you. Like, we have a theory of mind where we can, like...
Well, it's reasonable. You don't know exactly...
We can deduce sort of...
You don't know experientially what it's like to be me, obviously.
Yeah.
But
just
you
like
can
Thomas Nagel was talking about...
You can definitely come up with a reasonable idea of what it's like to be me based on you knowing what it's like to be you. Because you should... I think it's totally reasonable to assume that everyone else has a mind that's relatively like ours, most people.
Yeah, there's that thing, like, you find out people do sort of have, like, sort of a universal, almost, like, not like collective unconscious, but, like, sort of...
Just universal experiences.
Yeah, universal, like, emotions, experiences,
and you'll see that when you ask people, hey, have you ever felt what it's this kind of feeling when X, Y, and Z happens? Like, yeah, I felt that, and then everybody agrees, basically. Or, have you ever had a dream after you ate late at night or drank coffee right before you went to bed? Or you'll see the same things pop up over and over and over again across the board, basically, and then you realize it's perfectly reasonable to come to the conclusion based on all that, we're all basically operating off the same hardware and software here, mentally speaking, as opposed to some kind of bizarre, convoluted theory of, like, no, I'm the only person with the actual mind. Everybody else is just in my head. Ooh, like, those are just ridiculous.
Yeah, it's a little bit too solipsistic.
Well, too
pessimistic.
This is where where a logical framework would come in, and it's such a simple logical framework. Why would you go with the option that requires way more convoluted, unproven assumptions? Like, why would you choose the belief system that requires way more assumptions built into it? Like, now you're assuming that you're the only person with mind. You're assuming that everybody else is this. You're assuming that everyone else, even though they act just like you, basically, and talk like you and talk about the same experiences as you, no, it's really they're all robots, or they're all in my head, or they're like that. You're at that point, if you come up with a theory like that, you're assuming this, all these built-in assumptions stacked up, that it just becomes increasingly unreasonable. As opposed to, is it more reasonable to believe that all that with all these unproven assumptions built in, or is it more reasonable to just assume, hey, we're all conscious and we all generally have the same
I'd say
type of brains and
there's
stuff.
like a cursory type of collective tribe feeling everybody has, like there's different, like, you can tell there's like an aura of something in the air, like, like maybe with coronavirus coming on, it's like there's like definitely heightened different types of things going on. There's more acuity and maybe in perception, people trying to be more mindful. But yeah, like I definitely say all that extra assumption is sort of extraneous, but I would maintain, I personally believe that there's still no evidence to really... I'd still say there are certain... Like, you can look back at certain moments, experiential, whatever, and you can sort of deduce that, well, this moment as I experience it now like whether it's maybe a sunset or like a personal memory or something that's like closely to you, like maybe you had this very personal subjective nostalgia about like maybe a relative or that was close to you, or a moment that's very dear to you. That moment as you recall it, or how you've experienced it, is like totally inimitable and is just like characteristic of you. Like nobody knows exactly what it's like to experience at a moment.
Well, they don't. I would say they don't.
I mean, everybody
know what,
has
they don't
acute
know what it's like
moments
experientially in
subjective
terms of
thing too, but
they don't. They do not know your experience on an experiential level, but they can still analogize. They can still look at their experience and get something close to it, and, and surmise something close to it.
I guess it comes down to, can you make an objective statement about subjective?
Well, yeah. Well, this is where. First off, yes, but it depends on what you mean by that exactly. Yeah. I think Sam Harris gets into this too.
Yeah.
But also,
like
I would just say if what you're getting at is, can we objectively know what someone is experiencing in a way that's like totally confirmatory or whatever? Then the answer is no, but we don't need to, and like it's not necessary, even though it is kind of frustrating.
Because I think the closest thing Sam Harris said, you might have been about to say this about, like we don't know exactly what John F. Kennedy was saying when he was about to get when he was about to get shot by Lee Harvey Oswald, but we can say with at least
he wasn't thinking about
like he
this
wasn't
room
thinking
right
about,
now
like,
of us chatting in this
like,
room. That's an objective statement you can make about someone's subjective state of mind. That's
like almost like a Kantian a priori, I think, where it's like it's an objective truth garnered. It's like a priori meaning before.
And you don't even need to get into any.
It's like a tautology where it's like 2 + 2 = 4 on both sides of the universe. You don't need.
Well, it's not. Well, it's just. It's just saying that just saying that you can make an objective truth statement about somebody's subjective mind based on using what we know about how the world works, which is people can't tell the future. You're assuming
very
certain things
basic
that are pretty undeniable.
Yeah.
So.
I think one thing to be made clear about Kant is that there was sort of like this aura of like after sort of like a lot of the German idealists, there was a lot of hesitation after them because it left people a little bit like stultified or a little bit almost like at a loss of like what to do, because it was like Kant came in, it's like, oh, you thought you knew what objective knowledge was, like with Leibniz and Descartes, and like you thought you had all like this, you're able to derive knowledge and make objective empirical statements and know the world and all this stuff, like, and I think it was Kant was saying that David Hume sort of arose him something to the effect of like out of his dogmatic slumbers, I think, of like Leibniz, because David Hume thought that people were like slaves to their passions, I think, were like just not able to be like rational and like almost like anti-Enlightenment a little bit, like sort of like maybe in skepticism, although I think he predated the Enlightenment by a little bit, but definitely like there wasn't that sort of common theme of we can all be rational, or like a Spinoza, like I think everybody has it within themselves to work out that their assessment of the universe in a orderly way and see God as more of like a manifestation of nature, and that's God to me is like the pinnacle of like of this orderly universe that we see. It's like it's like this divine cosmological like order, I think. And basically Kant came along and sort of like threw everybody off with the whole Newmanan like theory, I guess, like this idea that you can't but ultimately you can't actually arrive at objective knowledge. You can't know things in themselves. You can experience phenomena, I think, like you can grasp at that with your world, but everything is like, as Schopenhauer said, like world of ideas, like that's what they both had in common, was this everything is ultimately at your subjective, like you use the mind to prove the mind, so it's this recursive type dilemma, but like you can't come to fully know objective knowledge. But it's weird because at the same time he's also saying, well, we can get pure reason out of that, and people can be reasonable still, but maybe I might be putting some words in his mouth in that, but like I think because I think in the critique of pure reason, like, he goes through like that whole entire scope of like, yes, like objective knowledge can't be known, like there's the synthetical knowledge, which is sort of like a combination of both a priori and sort of like, you know, experiential, I think a posteriori knowledge, and it's like sort of a synthesis of them both. And but ultimately I think it, like, you can't ever like confidently objectively say what's true and what's not, because like that's what the noumenon was like this thing in itself that it you cannot know them to exist. Like, you cannot.
Yeah, and I get that. You're not going to get this super objective thing because we're all just viewing everything from the lens of our own brains,
of
our
our
own
own
minds, whatever. But
yeah, that initial
but at the
assumption.
same time, it's like, well, that's kind of that's kind of our starting and ending point where there's nothing else that we know of that's a higher level objectiveness than that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, I feel like it's just putting an unreasonable, it's the bar is set too high. It's just set unreasonable and unrealistically high. You know what I mean? And it's like, just because we can conceive of some kind of some kind of uber objective point of view or perspective that knows everything in an objective, verifiable kind of 110% sure about it.
Even that
doesn't
held
mean
up
that
to
thing
scrutiny.
exists, and that doesn't mean we can have it or we do have it or ever will. So I just think it's unreasonable. I think it's just all the standards are set unreasonably high, and it's like, if this is what we have to work with in our operating system, I think we should make some assumptions, one of which is, yes, the universe exists, we exist, it's not solipsistic, other people have brains and minds just like us, because they act just like us, and they think and talk just like us, and we know that we have a brain and a mind, and we know we have an inner thought life, and we're conscious, so it's perfectly reasonable, and there's every reason to believe and no reason to not believe, in my view, that everyone else is conscious and thinks relatively the same as we do. You know what I mean? So I think that should be our baseline starting point, and you go from there. And then from there, you just sort of dig, and you find out certain things. You realize, oh, okay, people can see mirages. Oh, well, that's an optical illusion. Well, I know what that is. I know what causes it. I know how that's caused, why it's caused.
That's true. People do experience like similar illusory things where it's like your perception is warped. And people do have a comment
and you can figure out, well, I mean, our brains can trick us into thinking a mirage is real. Yeah, but we know what a mirage is now. We know what it is. We know it's not real. We know what causes it.
Yeah,
you know?
it's sort of,
then you move on. You
almost sounds like a Cartesian thing, like I think, therefore I am. It's like, well, by the very notion that I'm able to assert that I'm thinking is the very, well, that's reason enough to say that I exist. It's the very fact that I'm...
Well, it's kind of like, and it's a little similar to what Sam Harris was talking about. He was saying that consciousness is the one thing, and I'm not saying this is gospel, but he says consciousness is the one thing that can't be fake. It's the one thing that can't be an illusion, you know?
Yeah.
Even if we're living in a matrix simulation or whatever, which I don't think we are, but
still
even if
our
we were,
experience
that consciousness
of it
is still like a real thing.
Yeah, then there's like What It's Like to Be a Bat by Thomas Nagel. Delves into that a lot, which he's trying to sort of recant the whole sort of reductivist materialist notion that like everything can be, you know, proven by just purely like science, neuroscience specifically, and fact is that at the core there's still this subjective realm of like sphere of events, you know, that still can't be like fully like, you know, delineated by science. I mean, you can like reach at things, but it's like everything like it still seems to be going in circles. Surprised by like how even like just in like the last 50 years, like how much progress, but like, or maybe not as much progress as you think about like how consciousness, like we're still just scraping like the surface of like determining like what it is exactly and like getting to the bottom of it. It's just like,
oh, I wish there was an answer.
Yeah, that's why there's philosophy, but it doesn't necessarily have the answers. It sort of like leads you down like a more thoughtful route, but then you still hit roadblocks. But at least you're aware of the roadblocks, so it's good to be aware. But I get that maybe looking at things too much or speculating too much with little praxis or like practicality can be a thing. But I think like the fundamental like questions, sort of the elementary questions of consciousness are still very prescient or still very pertinent, especially in our day and age, especially with like concerning the self and like what, like for example, like somebody who loses an aspect of their brain, or like Phineas Gage, for example, who was a railroad worker in the 1800s, I think, like early to mid 1800s, and he had like a railroad spike, I think, lodged through his head, so he lost a piece of his brain, I think, maybe the hippocampus portion. And people who knew him said that he was not Gage. He was not the same person. There was something different about him. Like, he reacted more with angry. But then again, there was some...
Yeah, he, like, swore.
Yeah, he was more prone to rage. But then I think the scientists of the day were also using phrenology, and they were saying he's of the phrenobrillis type, which is very rage. They have a predisposition for anger and wrath, and like this is the way they are. They're very, I think nervobilist, I think we call them. But yeah, it's like we know phrenology is like sort of bunk. Like, it's just scraping at the surface of just like appearances of how people appear, and sort of like, oh, if he has a large head, if he has like a sort of a big meaty round head, that means he's a sanguine, outgoing type. And it's like, nah.
Yeah, and that's like the big thing for me is the question of, like, what interests me isn't the hypothetical cases of like, if you're, well, I mean, it's interesting, but that's not like the main thing. Like the whole, if you were cloned atom for atom, would you still be you and all that? I think the more harder question and realistic, more pertinent thing is, what do you do with somebody like Phineas Gage, you said his name was, whose brain is altered in such a way that they're in some very real sense they're not their old self anymore. What do you call that? How do you categorize that as a person? You know what I mean? And then just and
because there's also
just other mental conditions where the person is
like
no longer
dissociative identity
there.
disorder, formerly known as multiple personality, where you switch between differing personalities that are like almost like dichotomically contrasting. So there's like, mental illness is like a big thing. I think, to be fair, like Phineas Gage, some of like his condition might have been exploited. I think might have been sort of like hyped up for like science magazines of the day, and some people might have been hyperbolic about like his actions. But like, I definitely think that there were some people were like, oh no, he was still nice, and like he was still the same, hardworking, and he was together, he was himself. Like, so there's some different accounts, but still
other situations like the one and this is a theory, I don't know if this is like hardcore confirmed, and there is some level of quality to it where it'll never be fully confirmed one way or the other, but one guy from the 50s who went up in the tower above the college field area or whatever, and started picking people off with a rifle. And
I want
to say he wrote like a letter before he did all that. He was basically saying
a brain tumor.
I hope they cut open my brain and find out what's wrong with me or something like that. And then they did, and they found out that, well, they found some abnormalities in his brain, and the theory was that, the sort of conclusion was that there was something pressing on his amygdala, I think, or tumor pressing on his amygdala, which could have explained why he was suddenly being more aggressive, or was able to show that kind of aggression. So then you get in a situation like that, and you're like, well, is that what did that do? Like, was that the cause of it? And if so, did it alter his personality in such a way that he's basically not culpable for what he did? Or did it just alter his psychological makeup in a way where he still had a choice to do it or not, but it just made it way more likely for him to do it? And then that gets into question of like, well, what is that even, like, that's assuming like some kind of free will that may not exist, you know what I mean? Like the whole idea of, I think it makes it more likely you'll do something, but you still had the ability to choose not to. It's like, is that how it really works though?
Yeah, like that again goes back to that blank slate issue of like how much is influenced like by in neurology, like brain plasticity, where it's like sort of like the movement and locality in the brain, I think, like determines sort of how you act, and might follow suit that you might act in varying ways like not typical to yourself. But I'd say I'd say like Sam Harris's take on that with like the whole, like, I think he gave like a list in his free will pamphlet, like he was saying there's like he gave like a few examples of people that went on like different I think they were all pretty much convicted killers, I think, all homicides, And I think he gave like one example where it was like someone went out and like killed 3 people, and it was totally not. I'm just like giving an assumption of it, but like, or a quick summary of it, but like somebody went out and like killed, I think, like a few people, and it was totally not in their nature to do that, and like it was like totally atypical, and they found out afterwards that he had like a brain tumor. And then I think there was another one where somebody went out and I think might have raped and killed somebody, and then it was found out he didn't have any brain issues, but he did have like a history of like sexual abuse, I think. And then there's of course there's times when there's no like biological or like conditional or genetic maybe genes that can influence a person to do violence. Like I think Ted Bundy was saying like in an interview, like, yeah, I've had a normal Christian upbringing, wonderful parents, like I can't think of any reason why I would, like, I basically like you can't blame or place punitive measures on my parents for this, because like I've on my own volition I've basically done all these wrongs. So I think it was that what he was trying to appeal. And there could be something, maybe like, what if there's something, maybe there's a odd type of gene, maybe there's like a type of misfiring in like Ted Bundy's DNA that made him act in the way that he did. Certainly sociopathic, like, oh, sociopathic, he acts without empathy, he does this. But like you sometimes see people who are sociopathic, but he was also charismatic too, and he was extroverted, which is sort of like a little bit rare for a serial killer, or to have like sort of like you'll find some of them, but like typically you find like sort of antisocial social outcasts, I think, sort of the bottom of the rung in society, aren't going places. But he was successful. I think he was a lawyer. So I think like I'm wondering if it's just like there's this term we use, it's like, oh, they're sociopathic, they're psychopathic, but then there's also people who are who we could use are sociopathic, but they don't act on those impulses. So there was something in his condition, like, I don't know, conditioning, DNA, who knows. I think Richard Speck, people were trying to say that he was the guy that murdered, I think, like 8 nurses in like the late 60s. And I think scientists were trying to say that there was a gene that he had, because there was like this survey they took with men between like a certain height, and that they all sort of had similar attributes to Richard Speck, I think. And they're trying to say, well, because of that type of, I forget what it was some type of, but I think the conclusion was that it was some weird, it was an extra chromosome, I think. It was like a type of, as an instance of like a weird chromosome that arose in his genome, I think. But I think somebody came along later, like more modern science came along and sort of dispelled that. Yeah. I could be wrong on that, but yeah. And I think like Steven Pinker was saying in the Blank Slate that there's like 2,000 something genes in the Human Genome Project that they've amassed all together.
They mapped it all out, right?
Yeah, I think in the early 2000s.
That's pretty fucking cool. Something is actually finally objectively completed.
Yeah. Whereas like a lot of scientific things sort of seem to go on and on, you never find an answer.
Well, it's getting a little late. It's almost midnight. So.
Maybe I could say there's one more point I wanted to make about the idea of the self and like what madness is. It's like weird how we come up with like attributes for that, like this person is this and that, and like there's no, again, it's like this very, it's weird because like you're seeing so many mental illnesses arise nowadays. It's like all of a sudden everybody's depressed, everybody has anxiety, OCD. Well, that's the main maybe downfalls of like depth psychology, like analytic psychology, is that it did this thing where it opened up like the wellspring of like the psychoanalytic movement, and like Carl Jung and Freud and Adler, like all, you know, delving deep into like what the human psyche is, and all this intense gleanings on like new knowledge of like what, like, like of like more and more complex inner worlds of people that a lot of like behavioral psychologists like B.F. Skinner and I'm not sure if it was William James, but like sort of rejected, and saying like, oh, like I think it was B.F. Skinner who said like, give me 100 children in the same, or you know, any walk of life, and I can train them to be anything. Like I can train them to be a fireman, this and that, blah blah blah. Because he believed in the blank slate, that there was like, if you give him a child, he could, with the right
if you give
conditioning,
me a child, I'm gonna eat it.
If you give me a 2x4. But yeah, there's that. I think that is just too simplistic, too reductive.
Although
it's like
you
people
do
are
have
too
that family chess players. They raised all their daughters to play chess, and all of them became chess masters.
Yeah.
And were like very competitive
Yeah.
at it and really good at it. So there's
Yeah.
definitely something to be said for that as well. Then again, you could argue that the reason why they were all capable of being so good at chess is because they had the genetics of their parents who were both capable of being good at chess.
Yeah.
So then it kind of
And it's sort of it's sort of like minds sort of attract a lot, like more intelligent people will pair up and marry sort of like equally or close to intelligent people, typically. And yeah, it makes you wonder if it's all like, are there just inborn traits that you can't, because I think there was like one famous, he might have been a physicist, but he was, people kept saying like, oh, what great parents you must have had, and he was like, my dad was like a second generation immigrant, like he didn't have any history of the sciences or anything, he wasn't super educated. And I think he was saying like he had two sons, and he was like, oh, people were saying like, oh, we need to get your DNA and your sperm, like donate to the sperm bank so we can have more intelligent sperm or something. It was like social engineering, much genetic engineering, possibly.
Well, that is sort of an interesting.
And then he was
thing
saying, I think he was saying like, well, tell it to my sons, like one of them is like a plays in like a band or something, and then isn't like, you know, super in the intellectual, but it all depends on like the people, the popular sovereignty on like an individual basis. I think it's like that, even though Jordan Peterson, like the whole like clean your room thing sounds like you know, it's a bit silly at first, but like the whole entire idea of like, if you fix people on an individual basis and they all have their act together and aren't, you know, harboring like these, you know, antisocial type things, and if you know, inculcate people to be like that, to be like open-minded and compassionate, I think you can actually have societies where, and again, like you could get into that Dostoevsky, like, you know, Notes from the Underground, where he's like recanting this perfect utilitarian utopian society. I think it was by Nikolai Chernyshevsky, I think, was in this book called What Is to Be Done, and he was a Russian author that was a political theorist, I believe. And he was like saying that there's like this, it was like a fictional account of like what could be, and it was like this great, I think it was agrarian socialism, and everybody was happy, and like it went to the lives of these individual people that were all like a young man and a young woman that were both affected by the, or they both adored the society and allowed them freedom to flourish, and they didn't have to work strenuously, and they didn't have to labor and toil, like they all worked together, and it was like that equal, sort of like almost like a oppression type of look of socialism, I think, in Soviet Russia, where with like the working quotas and like working over the limit of that, and sort of, but like I guess it was sort of like the Platonic image of that, like not gone awry. But Dostoevsky was sort of arguing against that, saying, well, what if man's instincts, Dostoevsky's belief was that people are fundamentally irrational and actually sort of revel in suffering.
Yeah,
and like they secretly like it.
Keys thing.
Yeah,
Was
like
that
men
his
are.
idea?
Yeah, like men are not piano keys. It's like this idea of like, well, math, and we can all assert certain objective truths, like tautology is like 2 + 2 = 4. Like, you know, all bachelors are unmarried, but like the underground man was sort of taking that logical type of thing and sort of bringing it to its logical conclusion in that axiom, and he was trying to like expound, or trying to demonstrate sort of that it wasn't infallible, and saying like, well, what if I fancy that 2 + 2 = 5? Like, in fact, I actually do fancy that 2 + 2 = 5. So he was like trying to go through this, he was sort of like bringing it down to its like regressive form, and I think he was saying men are not piano keys, or I think yeah, he was saying that that's a very causal, deterministic thing. He was basically like the whole entire necessitarian positivist. There's only one way of looking at the universe, and everything's material, everything can be logically explained, and basically the underground man was saying, no, not everything can be logically explained. Like, there's this part of us that's irrational, logical, and defies that, and we will, you know, like, for no other reason, just to say that we can, to assert our own free will, we will like destroy perfectly good relationships, even like when everything's going good and well. Like we will steer it, you know, in a awry. We'll invite disorder into our lives, and I think he was saying like, I don't care how much destruction out there is, like, as long as I have my tea at the end of the day. So he was like saying, like, on a personal level, like, he didn't really care about like this the society as a whole, the collective. He was just like, I don't care about any of that. Like, I just want my tea. I love, like, Notes in the Underground is like one of my favorite because it's like the first existentialist novel. It was like sort of the first piece of literature that actually sort of implemented some existential idea of reality, like existence precedes essence. And I love how like like the underground man starts it off and like saying like, my liver is diseased, and I'm middle aged, but rarely does a man like me live past middle age or whatever. Like, what a accomplishment it is to make it past 40 or something to that effect. And he's basically saying all these things, like he's like establishing himself as like as an outcast, as excommunicated, and he's like in this abject St. Petersburg slum, I think, and he's like writing this out. And I love how like mid narrative, I think in media res, it sort of picks up and he actually goes back out to like meet up with these old school friends, I think, and he basically just like crashes their party, and he's like drunk, and then he just ruins everything, and he's just like he's like inebriated, and and he's basically, there was a lot of insecurity. It's like this type of thing where it's like you can identify with the underground man in his witticisms and his cleverness, and he's like he's like in his rebuttals of all like these necessitarian beliefs, but like at the same time he's like torn, and he's screwed up. He's not right in the head. He's just like crazy and like mad and delirious, and there's like, what's brilliant about it is that the fact that he's like trying to assert like throughout the whole entire thing like his free will and his autonomy, and like he even gets into like these petty altercations with like this, like I think an officer that walks by him, and he's like, he always walks by and hits my shoulder, like I'll show him that like when I walk by I will hit his shoulder instead. It's like so he's like, it shows like part of his recant and rebuttal of all that comes from like a personal whim, comes from like this personal irrationality on his part that like makes no sense, but it's so human, and it's so like who we are. And at the end of the novel, when he ends it, like after he's crashed like his old school classmates party and like ruins everything, and then he goes home with a prostitute named Liza, and he basically
Bob
yeah
story.
And like I think he like takes her home or something from the brothel that they're at, because they go to a brothel, and then like he after he like lies with her, he basically like starts like just like tearing her apart like verbally, and he's like, your life, like you will not live past, or forget exactly what he said, but he just has like this scathing monologue about like this diatribe against her, like how like worthless everything is, and how abject and horrible her place in society is, and she'll never find success, and she'll never find happiness, and she just like walks off in tears. And I think he like runs after her, because I think it's like the last human essence he has within him is to like run back and sort of repent about what he said. And I think at the end of it, he's just like in tears at the feet of Liza, just like completely breaks down and cries and says, I forget what he says, I'm gonna have to look this up, but he says something like it's like a certain phrase or something. He gives her a 5 ruble note, I think, and so he begins to criticize himself and states that he is actually horrified by his own poverty, and he's basically just projecting this onto Liza, and then she realizes how pitiful he is, and then embraces him, and then the underground man cries out, they won't let me, I can't be good. And then at that point she leaves, and then at the end he like says like, it seems that we may stop here, and then he says, I've merely carried to an extreme in my life what you have not dared to carry even halfway, which I think is like a big part of it, is like this tenacity, like it's like, it's like that classic allure of fiction that's so appealing, is this ability to sort of represent something so grotesque, and so like I would never be that, I would never do that, like you've constructed this horrible grotesque thing, why would you do that, why would you write about this, Flannery O'Connor, this thing that's so like this nihilistic man that is like licentious and crude and murders people, and like, or about the, why would Franz Kafka write about a man who turns into a bug, or like these horrible things about like arbitrary deaths and judgments, like why would you like, this isn't reality, but like you don't understand, it's like you have to assert some twisted, grotesque view of reality in order to see truth in these cases. Like it's like, yes, the underground man is like maybe a augmented version, but he's a very, very real. That's why it's so valuable. He's a very. There's so much more truth in that than just a reiteration of facts or descriptive ethics or descriptive knowledge or just like a like a IRS tax book. That's pure facts. But like from this, like there's something deeper, and it's something that's very in the very essence of human nature. I think it's that it speaks to you on that level and communicates a different, more invaluable form of truth.
Yeah.
So that's my soapbox for the day.
Yeah, there's definitely something about literature that can hit different than similar to movies. It depends. I think it's just movies are a similar but just different medium.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's pretty close. And then video games now can kind of get close to that as well, with their own sort of unique way of going about it, though, because with video games the player is in control to some degree or another, so that can change the dynamic or add some interesting parts to it. Like what's his name, Folding Ideas, talking about ludonarrative dissonance in video games. Like, you cannot, that's a unique form of that in a video game,
Right.
that you can't have, as far as I recall, in any other medium. So yeah.
Does that have to do with like diegesis at all, like diegetics? I think is
Well,
like
there's
how I think
diegetic.
it's mostly with film. I think that applies to like film narratives and how they unfold.
Yeah, I'm not sure. There's different versions of the word. There's different meanings of the word diegetic. If you talk about diegetic sounds, I think, or sounds that take place in the world of the movie, as opposed to sounds added, as part of the music or soundtrack or something.
Yeah,
like
it sounds like what happens in Come and See, directed by Elam Klimov. I think there's some examples of diegetic sounds that are like subjectively processed by the main character.
Yeah.
In sort of a dream state.
Anywho, that's to
Okay.
goes to the end.
Could I just add one more thing? And yeah.
How long
but,
is
like,
this gonna?
I was just gonna quickly sort of like say that there's like some parallels between Kafka, Dostoevsky, Camus, Flannery O'Connor.
Yeah.
It was like fiction has the power to illuminate truths via the absurd. It shows up a lot in existentialism is the absurd, which is basically the lack of any meaning in the life or in life in general, and it would otherwise repulse readers, but it's garnered in a more honest way, whereas you typically wouldn't find a compelling message in a book of Strax or strictly philosophical tomes. Like Franz Kafka's works, for example, like In the Penal Colony, The Castle, The Trial, Metamorphosis, The Judgment, they seem to just discuss apparently arbitrary matters with cold, precise detail. Like the Metamorphosis is where traveling salesman Gregor Samsa wakes up one morning and finds out that he was turned into a bug. Although I think the German phrase is actually vermin. I think it was like Die Wander. It was like literally, I think the original title was like Die Wanderschwelt or something, or Die Wander. But basically it translates to vermin, which is like anything that's not a mammal, I think, any insect type thing. So people would typically take that as a beetle. I think Vladimir Nabokov believed it could have been a beetle that Kafka was alluding to, but there's definitely like the sense of like, to sort of spoil it, like if you just go through sort of page by page, it's like this is what the summary of it, like the exegesis is that Gregor wakes up, finds out he's a bug. His family doesn't know it, doesn't know that he's a bug. They can't really defer, like, okay, well, he's gone, he's not in his room, and they find this bug there instead. So they decide to take care of the bug anyway, under some suspicions, but they're still ultimately like convinced that it's not him, for the most part. And so he slowly starts to they feed him every day, and he tries to, I think in gestures, sort of communicate that he is a bug, but it's totally like worthless, because basically all his efforts are fruitless, because there's like really no way, I mean, like you could like try to do like some clever thing. Like there's always like a clever type of postmodernist type of thing, I think David Foster Wallace is pointing out, where people might not get Kafka's work because they don't have those preconceived supposed ironic meta narratives of like, oh, and then this happened, and then this person did this, and like it was a clever little reference to that, and logically following this would there's not like that clever little witty thing. It's very plainly told in like this cold, precise detail. And yeah, like like there's no feasible way of him communicating that he's a bug. But like it's interesting because the first thing that Gregor worries about, is the fact that he's not going to be able to show up to his job, and that there's no way of telling him. So it shows like sort of the status. It establishes very early on that he cares for his family, and that he wants to like give to his sister, and like he wants to like pay for like I think a violin lessons, I think, for her to go to music school, I think. Yeah, he wants her to go to a musical conservatory and to like flourish in life, and he's basically, that's why he's so like dedicated to his job. But now like this absurd thing has happened. He's turned into a bug, and eventually they sort of lose faith that in any way that it could possibly be Gregor. So they just let the bug sort of rot and die there. And eventually he like,
jeez,
in one final fit of desperation, I think he sort of goes to his family, and then he like goes when his I think his sister is like playing the violin, and he's very moved by it, and he's like trying to cry. It's like very like sad actually, and he like goes up to her, and he tries to like in a moment of like in a gesture of affection tries to like go up to her, but they're repelled by it, and they're like scared by it. So like the immediate sort of visceral reaction is to like get rid of it. So eventually I think they just banish it back to the room. The father actually goes in and like actually with some sort of cudgels it, I think, with like a blunt object, and like actually like almost kills Gregor, and basically leaves it. They all leave him to die, and I think they collectively agree it's like, no, that can't be him, like that it's absurd. There's no way it could possibly ever. There's no possibility it could be him, so they just let him die. I think they all agree to do that, and then it sort of ends with that decision, and like he passes away, and and then it ends with the family going out on a picnic, and they all sort of have a good time, and they're moving on, and they don't seem to be too bogged down by Gregor Samsa's death or disappearance. They sort of just move on with it, and at the end of the movie, at the end of the novella rather, he emphasizes that his sister gets up and like sort of stretches out, and she looks like youthful and healthy, and they all looks happy, and it ends on that note. So yeah.
So he doesn't die?
No, he does die at the end. The narrator, I think, is just sort of like a outside type of outside the narrative.
The ending is that even though he's dead, they're at least happy. Is that supposed to be a depressing or happy ending?
It's not fully confident, like all these literary different exegesis of it. I think some people were saying that there was themes of betrayal in there, like about family betrayal, and some people were saying there could be a religious connotation, like it could be the transforming of a man. It could be like maybe a man after like maybe being born again in some way, and is sort of maybe excommunicated and shut off by their family. I personally read it. Some of it could actually seem like mental illness a little bit. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I always got the notion that Gregor Samsa could represent somebody who sort of lost their mind, maybe. And like the more you lose your sense of self, the more and more the less you are. So like the family reacting to that, like that the fact that that he's metamorphosized into this bug is, they argue like, sort of ethically, is it him, like, or would it be unethical, or sort of the big question. So I always thought there could be some implications of it being like a mental disorder, and maybe losing a sense of self and like identity, and like that could be akin to sort of transforming into this thing, into this entity that's totally different unto yourself, and like maybe your family losing connection with you because maybe they can't find a sense of connection because that's gone, because like there's no definitely like
kind of ripe for metaphors there.
Yeah, that's what I love about it, is that like even though it's told so plainly, there's not like one word of like philosophizing per se going on. There's not one word of like theory or this or like clever little narratives or little things going on, but there is definitely like this ripe for metaphor like arising underneath all that. So, anyway, Alien. How do I want to be? I want to be vampire. Alien. I also did want to discuss Albert Camus' The Plague, but it's getting sort of late, so I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, I got stickers to be in.
If you want, you could borrow it for me, because I have a copy of it. It's not too long. It's maybe about 200 something pages. But if you were willing, maybe we could just make a separate small discussion thing with just that, because that's also sort of bursting with metaphor as well. It's a thing that stinks about this is that there's so many different things, and there's like intertextuality, and there's themes, and there's like how it ties into philosophy, and then there's not just that, but there's also the maybe a scientific biological view, and then there's like a anthropological cultural view, and there's sociology, then there's literature, and then there's just literature theory, which is like a whole entire subject unto itself, and there's semiotics and psychology, and there's just so many different like variegated
It's fitted with a variegated actuator that allows the user to.
but yeah, I think that would be a good place to end.